Thank you for joining me. My name is Esther Peters, and I am the Associate Director for the Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies at the University of Chicago. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight a couple people you'll see some more of a little bit later today, this evening. We are joined by Joya Mukherjee from Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and our guest tonight is Simon Ostrovsky, a PBS NewsHour Special Correspondent and a producer for New York Times Video, and more from both of them in just a few minutes. So tonight's webinar, Justifying War, How Russia Convinced Its People to Take Part in the Land Grab of the Century, is the first of a 4-part Educator professional development series entitled The Global Rise of Disinformation in Times of Conflict. I will just say I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit of information about how you can contact us. But if you, again, look in the chat, you'll see more information about our center and how to contact us, as well as how to get in touch with all of the other centers that are co-sponsoring this. And very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and at this point, turn things back over to Joya just to do a quick discussion of Pulitzer Center.
Yeah, thank you so much, Esther. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm seeing some familiar names in the chat and of course some new ones. So we are just so happy that you are here. My name is Joya. I work with the Pulitzer Center, a journalism organization dedicated to raising awareness about underreported global issues through direct support for quality journalism across all media platforms and a unique program of education and public outreach. On the next slide, you're going to see the latest information on global underreported stories by following us on Instagram and Twitter, or by visiting our website at pulitzercenter.org. Now I will pass it back to Esther. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joya. That was great. And so now let's turn to tonight's main event and introduce our speaker, journalist Simon Ostrovsky. Simon is an award-winning broadcast journalist, best known for his coverage of the 2014 Crimea crisis and the war in Eastern Ukraine for Vice News, for which he was awarded the prestigious DuPont Award from Columbia University and was nominated for 2 Emmys. He also won a 2013 Emmy as producer of Vice on HBO. Simon is currently a PBS NewsHour Special Correspondent and a producer for New York Times Video. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February, his coverage has focused on war crimes perpetrated by Russian forces in the Kyiv environs and the humanitarian crisis that has resulted in millions of Ukrainians being forced from their homes. His work is frequently supported by the Pulitzer Center. And tonight, Simon is going to be discussing 3 recent pieces he has worked on for PBS NewsHour and New York Times Video. We'll be playing some short clips from each of these pieces, but we will include links to the full videos as we share those clips. And I really want to encourage you to watch all of them. We were just talking about how much had to be cut from the full videos. And so we've had to cut even more so we can actually talk about as much as possible. But I do want to encourage you to watch. They're all great. So, and absolutely fascinating pieces. So I encourage you to watch all of them when you get a chance. We also want to make sure to provide as much time for questions from the audience as we can. So please, the Q&A box is open. I encourage you to enter your question at any time. We will be taking questions throughout tonight's presentation. After we've had a chance to discuss each story, we're going to try and take questions from the audience as well. And then at the end, we'll try and take some questions that help knit all of these things together. And so we'll have significant time also at the end for questions. So just keep adding them. Please use the Q&A box as best as possible. We'll remind you as we need to. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and go ahead and turn things over to Simon.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Esther, for that wonderful introduction. And Joya, thank you as well for helping put all of this together. As Esther and Joya mentioned, I'm a Pulitzer Center grantee and a journalist. And I am fortunate enough to be able to travel around the world on the Pulitzer Center's dime quite often. So I just want to say thank you to them for that. And actually, the first story that we're going to be talking about today was also done with funding from the Pulitzer Center, because the Pulitzer Center gave a huge mountain of money to PBS NewsHour that was specifically earmarked towards coverage of the war in Ukraine after the outbreak of the full-scale invasion back in February. So if any of you are PBS viewers, a lot of the coverage from, in fact, all of the coverage from Ukraine since then that you've been watching will have been created with support of the Pulitzer Center. So I can't thank them enough. And the story that I went out there to do, I actually, you know, when you get sent to a breaking news event like a war that's constantly changing all the time, you never know exactly what the story that you're going out to cover is going to be. But we did have a sense in April that the Russian forces were pulling back from the areas around Kiev. And it was very important for me to be able to get into the Kiev Oblast, the Kiev region and Chernihiv region where the Russians were, because I realized that there would be a very short space of time when people's memories would be fresh to recount, you know, what they had witnessed and what had happened to them while that area had been occupied. I mean, at the beginning of the war, you know, it was, people were predicting that Kiev was going to fall in a matter of days, and we felt like it was going to be impossible to find out what happened under the Russian occupation, because the Russians would still be there and make it very difficult for any reporting to take place. And so, you know, I saw this as an opportunity to jump in there and talk to people. But even I couldn't have predicted the true scale of the atrocities that happened there. I knew it was going to be bad. I knew I was going to hear some terrible stories, but you know, what I was confronted with literally the next day after I got there was even beyond, you know, my worst predictions. So with that, I think we should roll the short clip that we've selected from one of the pieces that I did in the 2 weeks that I was in Ukraine in March. And then we can talk about it a little bit more. And this piece, just so you guys know, was filmed in Bucha, I'd say about 4 or 5 days after Russia withdrew its forces.
In Bucha itself, the Russian retreat has exposed the horrors of war for Ukrainian civilians. Volunteers bagged the bodies of a group of men, unceremoniously dumped behind a building, presumably by the Russians who used it as a base and left behind their waste and army-issued food rations. What we've seen here is 8 bodies, some of them with their hands tied behind their backs. This could be evidence of war crimes. The soldiers we're here with say that they were tortured before they died. One of the men with tied hands is shirtless. His body is bruised, and he appears to have died from a bullet wound to the head.
I know one of these people personally. I've talked to him. His wife called me and asked me to help. Andrei Bornikov. He drove a minibus for a company in Kyiv.
Also shot in the head?
Yes, in the head.
Behind the local cathedral, a mass grave. We saw 13 bodies still exposed, but there are as many as 57 beneath the ground, according to Agence France Presse. In all, more than 300 civilian bodies have been recovered in Bucha so far, according to the community's funeral director. Part of Russia's response to allegations that its forces committed war crimes has been to blame the Ukrainians themselves for killing their own people after Russian forces pulled out on March 31st. That timeline isn't supported by the evidence. Bodies like these of men in civilian clothes with gunshot wounds to the head in a partially decomposed state. It also doesn't square with the accounts of residents of Bucha itself.
They just took people and shot them for nothing, just before they fled.
The last 5 days they were here, you could hear it, because before it was relatively quiet. You just hear their vehicles, but then there was automatic gunfire all over their place. They killed an old lady in the school. We carried a body with a head wound out of a 9-story building. We also found some civilians in a garden over there, all of them straight to the head.
Bucha and Irpin are as far as Russia's armored.
So yeah, some pretty horrific stuff there. But I guess the point of showing that clip was to point out how Russia had tried to turn around what we saw with our own eyes on the ground and turn it on its head and blame it on the Ukrainians themselves, which, you know, is a true and tried tactic that the Russian government uses all of the time in order to deflect criticism and in order to convince its own peoples that their own people that they're fighting for a just cause. So one of the first things that came out after images like the ones that you saw in that report started circulating around the world. And I don't know how clear it was from the picture because the video seems like it was a little bit choppy at my end. But you know, if you had watched it online, then you'd be able to see that the bodies that we found there had belonged to people who had clearly been executed because they had their hands tied behind their backs and they were undressed and they had bullet wounds to the head and to the chest. So it's pretty clear without a doubt that these people were unarmed and unable to defend themselves when they died. And that's a war crime. And so what the Russians started saying immediately after those pictures came out was, well, here, actually, we withdrew, the Ukrainians came in, and in the 1 or 2 days before journalists got there, it was actually Ukrainian military units who had gone around, and there was several, you know, variations of the story that they told. But one variation was that Ukrainian units had gone around and killed local residents as reprisals for allegedly collaborating with the Russians while they were there. The other thing they said was that the bodies were brought there from somewhere else and strewn throughout the streets in order for the journalists to have something to film to make the Russians look bad. And you know, if you're hundreds of miles away and you have been primed by years and years of fake Russian news reports to believe that the Ukrainians are up to no good, you've got no way of checking for yourself, then it's easy to believe something like that. And I think people here don't realize just how huge the chasm in understanding of what is taking place in Ukraine is between our understanding of what's going on over there and the Russian people's understanding of what's going on over there. But those kinds of things are easy to blow out of the water if you're actually on the ground like I was, and you can see that the bodies are in such a state that there's no way that they could have been brought there, you know, the day before, or that they were killed in the couple of days after the Russians pulled out, because they were already in a state of partial decomposition, which is saying a lot because it was very cold at the time. When we got there, there was still some snow around. So we knew that those bodies had been there a lot longer than the Russians were claiming that they were. And we started piecing together this systematic picture of how the Russians had been operating there, which was then, you know, brought to a huge scale in eastern Ukraine. We'll talk about that a little bit later with the filtration camps. But the principle of what they were doing in Bucha and what they're doing right now in eastern Ukraine with the filtration camps that they send people through is the same. It's to take anybody, particularly males, who seem like they could be a potential threat, to do a cursory interrogation. And if there's any suspicion that this person could be somehow affiliated with the resistance or with the Ukrainian military, to, if they're lucky, capture them and hold them as prisoners of war and transport them back to Russia. And if they're unlucky, to just kill them on the spot, which seems to be what happened in the last several days of the Russian occupation of the areas around Bucha.
Can I ask just kind of chime in with a question here maybe? And I guess one of the things I would be interested in is if you could pinpoint, because it seems to me that trying to report on and just get, that in that kind of cliche saying that, journalism is the first draft of history, that without, say, the Russian campaign of disinformation, of making up, of saying, oh, this was the Ukrainians, this was a false flag operation of some kind, or this is to make us look bad, that it would be difficult. What are the challenges related to trying to figure out what has happened when something this horrific has happened? And then what are maybe the specific challenges related to any disinformation campaign, and specifically one that the one that, say, the Russian state media campaign is doing with regards to Bucha? And then I'll get to a question we already have from our audience after that, maybe.
Sure, and that's actually a really good question, because the challenges are huge. And you have to understand that when I was going into this situation, having seen literally the day before we got there, just several photographs that had been taken by, still photographs that had been taken by agency photographers from AP and Reuters, I believe. I'd seen them being shared on social media first, and I'm immediately distrustful when I see something on social media about its validity. And the photographs seemed so unbelievable that I wasn't sure until I got to Bucha that I would be able to actually find anything and be able to confirm this story. The entire first day that I was in Bucha, and I went back many times over the course of 2 weeks, but on the first day, my primary mission was to just establish, had this actually happened, because I kind of, it was suspicious. It seemed like an information operation that the Ukrainians would have wanted to carry out. A young woman and young men's bodies, like in their nice clothing, lying face down with their hands behind their back. It just seemed like, could this really happen? It seemed unbelievable. So we had in a couple of days, it wasn't possible to drive around in Bucha independently because they were still demining the city. And so we had to have a police escort. And I would say interior ministry escort, more of a sort of militarized situation. And they were kind of driving us around and showing sites. And it wasn't until sort of midway through the day that we got to the first house where there were a couple of bodies in a courtyard that you saw in that clip towards the end, with the bullet holes in their head. And then I was like, okay, so here's a couple of bodies. These guys are wearing civilian clothes, but it's been a long time since they've been laying here. So I don't have the full picture. I see that they have gunshot wounds to the head. Maybe that's an execution, but maybe that's a sniper. These men are unarmed. Maybe they had arms at the time that they were killed, and then this wouldn't qualify as a war crime. So how am I supposed to know exactly what happened here? And I'm like, this isn't enough to confirm the story that seems to be percolating up through social media right now of people having been executed, although there was some, evidence that that could have been the case. So we kept searching, and we got to the engineering firm building about an hour and a half or 2 hours later, where we found 8 of the bodies behind the building, and the cleanup crews were in the process of bagging them to take them away to the morgue when we got there. And I had to literally stop one of the guys and tell him, look, this is important. I need to be able to see their hands. And they weren't happy about that because they're doing a very grim task and they've been doing it for the last couple of days. And it seemed voyeuristic to them, but it was really important for us to be able to establish that the people who had been killed had been unarmed when they were killed and that that was an execution. And so once we saw that and understood that, then I realized, the full scope of what had happened. But even then, when you're just dealing with a situation when you're looking at 8 bodies of people who are completely anonymous to you, you don't have the full story. You know that they've been executed, but you don't know who they are. You don't know what they represented. And I started talking to the funeral director for the city who was there administering the collection of the bodies. And it just so happened by chance, because there were hundreds of bodies around the city, that he knew personally one of the people who was there and was willing to put me in touch with that man's, I guess you would call it girlfriend in English. He called it civil wife, I guess. And they had lived together for several years. And that was, as a reporter, that was a really huge stroke of luck for me. And not something that when you hear something like that, you can't leave it behind. You have to sort of latch into it and try to start pulling that thread. Because I could have found 20 more bodies in the city that day if I had continued searching for them. And never found heads or tails of the story of any one of them because they don't have any ID on them. Also, I'm not going through their pockets to try to find that out. I just got lucky that there happened to be a guy there who knew who that person was. And then we could go and find the girlfriend and find out what his actual story was. Those are the challenges that they're very sort of simple, it seems like, looking back, but you kind of have to just rely on being there and getting lucky.
That's yeah. I don't know what else to add. That's kind of an amazing story.
That's why it's so difficult to do journalism from a distance, because those kinds of things don't happen when you're an opinion writer sitting on your couch and you're analyzing other people's pieces. On the ground reporting is so incredibly important, because it's the only way, by speaking to people, by people who are witnesses, to directly to actually find out what's going on.
That's, yeah, just another reason to plug why it's important to support actually having journalists and the funding for journalists to actually get to places.
Yes,
totally natural. We were just, wasn't intended, but it just a great example of why that's so important. I do want to just maybe pull a couple questions and kind of combine them. They're kind of related from Devlin and Isaac. So Devlin Rogers asks, what would you infer to be the purpose of the executions? And then Isaac, I think, Isaac Rainey asks a related question. He says, going off what you said earlier about the expectation of a quick war, do you believe the Russian forces were so sloppy in the cover-up of the physical evidence of their atrocities, or why were they so sloppy? Is a possible explanation because of an expectation that they would not lose Bucha. So I don't know if you want to talk either about why the kind of these kind of executions at this scale, and then the reason for being so sloppy or leaving so much evidence of these atrocities and not trying to cover them up maybe a little bit better that we might have expected.
Well, I can hear in these questions this sort of view of what's taking place in Ukraine through the prism of our own understanding of how people should behave. And I think the purpose of the killings was twofold. One, it was to get rid of people who could be potentially dangerous to the Russians in the future by taking up arms against Russia as the war continues, or even just in the general area where they were executed. But the other thing is to instill terror in everybody, in that particular town, but in Ukraine as a whole, which goes towards answering the second question, which is why they were so bad at covering it up. It was because they didn't try to cover up. Part of the point of doing executions like this is to send a message and to terrorize and terrify the people that who would have the bravery to take up arms against you. And this isn't anything new. This isn't something that that just started now in this latest chapter of the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin came to power, and I'm sorry, it looks like I'm being like beamed away by the sun coming out of the window. But Vladimir Putin came to power on the back of starting a campaign to conquer Chechnya, and in the Second Chechen War in 1999. And the brutality of that war was incredibly obvious on the one hand. It was completely on the surface. Tens of thousands of people died, were murdered, disappeared, executed. The country was, and it was a sovereign country, by the way, at the time when Vladimir Putin came to power, was brutalized to such an extent that now, more than 20 years later, the next generation of people who were born in Chechnya are actually serving as foot soldiers in Putin's latest conquest. And that's how the Russian state, the Russian government operates. They suppress a population by terrifying them, brutalizing them totally, by rewriting the history after they win, and then by forcing the children of those who they conquer to go fight in their next war.
That actually feels like a great segue into, it feels weird to say great, but it feels like an appropriate segue to the next story we're going to talk about, which is Journey to Transnistria Inside Russia's Disinformation Bubble. Did you want to introduce this, or should we just play the clip, Simon?
I'll give a little bit of background, because Transnistria is a little bit off the beaten path and not everybody knows the context going into it. And all that context was at the beginning of the piece, which we're not including in this piece. And I know that you guys, a lot of you are people who study the region, but for those of you who may have just happened to see the post on Twitter that the Pulitzer Center sent out and signed up that way. Transnistria is a rebel region inside Moldova. It was, I believe, the first breakaway quasi-state to result in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it has been sort of run as a Russian vassal state since 1992. Within the recognized borders of Moldova, but it's Russian speaking. The symbolism they use there, the state symbols were kept intact from the Soviet era. And while the rest of Moldova sort of moved towards Europe in fits and starts and lurches, the Transnistria stayed firmly in the past and retained its connection, political, economical, military, with Russia, despite the fact that it doesn't share a border with Russia, and Ukraine separates it from the Russian mainland. And so the reason we went there was because the population generally mostly watches Russian television, and so it was a good opportunity for us to be able to take the temperature, to sort of find out what people who live on a Russian media diet think about the war in Ukraine. Because unfortunately, since the war in Ukraine began, it became more difficult to operate as a journalist in Russia itself. So this seemed like a good second choice if you're trying to figure out what Russia-minded people are thinking. So with that, let's watch the clip.
Из-за того, что Россия начала войну в Украине, возможно ли изменение отношения приднестровских людей к самой России? Как вы считаете?
Я вам еще раз говорю, я против войны. И что, вы как-то задали вопрос, Россия начала войну. А может глубже мы копнем? А из-за чего все это вот началось? Из-за чего? Из-за того, что войска НАТО стояли уже в Харькове, из-за того, что там биологическое оружие, из-за того, что создали ядерную грязную бомбу, а Россия виновата.
Так а почему они не заявили о том, что до войны, что у них цель избавиться от этого оружия? Они сказали об этом после того, как они уже начали воевать.
А где вы видели, чтобы политик говорил правду всему народу? Есть такое, что в Америке Байден все рассказывает, как оно все есть.
Senika is repeating false claims about biological weapons and dirty bombs that have been made over and over on Russian state-owned news broadcasts.
Анализ документов, попавших в руки наших военных, показал, что Пентагон напрямую причастен к разработке компонентов биологического оружия на Украине.
False reports like this one are readily accepted here. Another false claim spread by Russia is that Ukraine is now run by ultranationalists who want to eradicate Russian speakers.
Что несут украинцы, я имею в виду украинские власти, сейчас по поводу русских? Русские – это тараканы. Кастрировать, убивать, искать где? Кто говорит по-русски? По голове.
In reality, it ignores the fact that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is himself a Russian speaker whose ancestry is Jewish. Just a few doors down from Senika, we see a group of three older men.
Ну, я вот немножко краем уха услышал вот разговор, который вы сейчас разговаривали. Как вы думаете, что случится в Украине?
Как предполагаем, что уже Россия будет идти до конца, потому что там национализм, и это как бы неприемлемо.
Зеленский, он националист?
Очевидно, да. А иначе кто так поступит? Можно я скажу? Откуда у еврея может быть национальность? Он же еврей. У него же родина есть. Если с ним заканчивать, то надо полностью Украину.
Тут много российского телевидения смотрят.
Да, мы постоянно смотрим.
А когда про политику, то какие каналы выбираете?
Я смотрю «Россия-24», Первый канал.
А украинские каналы, они говорят, что вот кассетные бомбы, больницы в Мариуполе в них попадают. Тут такого не передают?
Передают. Дело в том, что такие ракеты О-1, они на вооружении в России уже давным-давно не стоят. Это еще СССРовские запасы остались на Украине.
То есть Россия не стреляет по больницам, там, по жилым кварталам?
Я служил. У меня бы рука не поднялась.
Sergei seems to be suggesting Russia doesn't use Soviet-era armaments, but that's not true.
I actually had a lot of fun doing that story because I kind of like getting into the arguments with the people who live there and trying to pull their most ridiculous views out of them with sort of probing questions, and then throwing back some of my knowledge about the conflict and about the post-Soviet space, right back at them. There's not like a lot of arguments that you can have in this world where you always feel like you can win. But this was a situation where I felt like I had, a stack of knowledge that I could just like pick from and pull from. The point wasn't obviously to try to convince them and bring them over to the factual based view of what was taking place in Ukraine. The point was to try to tease out what their actual views were. And I think we did a really good job with that piece. And I guess I have to mention that one was funded with support from the Knight Wallace Reporting Fellowship from the University of Michigan. And it actually got a lot of interest when it came out, because again, I think like the gap between our understanding over here in America of what's happening in Ukraine and what we think Russians think is happening in Ukraine is so huge. Because yes, we know that the Russians are fed a lot of propaganda and therefore they have some different views. But sometimes when things that are so horrible happen, we think like, could it really be possible that this isn't getting through? And the fact of the matter is, it is possible, and it's not getting through. And this piece took several weeks to edit together. It was very beautifully shot by Emily Ryan of the New York Times. And it actually ended up coming out after I was already on assignment for NewsHour in Bucha. And so one of the things that my editor at the New York Times asked me was, she was worried, was it still relevant? Couldn't we still publish this piece given what we know has happened in Bucha, which surely has probably changed the minds of the people that we interviewed. And there's one interview in this piece that, now that I think about it, we should have run, because it's the one in English, and there was a real sound lag with the subtitles just now, which probably made it hard to view. But I was still in touch with her, so I, just for my editor's sense of calm, I got back in touch with one of the people that we interviewed for that story, and I asked her, if she believed that Russia had perpetrated the mass executions in Bucha. And surprise, surprise, of course not. No, I mean, if you're being fed that media diet day in and day out, and for years you've been primed to believe that the Ukrainians are nefarious tricksters who are always up to no good, then the next event taking place isn't going to change your mind. I actually kind of think about it in the same way as I think about the gun debate here in the United States. A lot of people think, well, this latest atrocity was so terrible that surely this is going to change people who support gun ownership, sway them, because just the shocking scale of the violence. But that's not what happens, because it's not about facts on the ground. It's more about sort of tribal affiliation, which is much more important to people than something that they don't necessarily have direct personal contact with. People don't really end up believing things, I find, until they see them with their own eyes, or they're experienced by people who are close to them, who they trust.
Can I wonder, and this is a bit related to a question I just saw pop up in the Q&A box, again from Devlin, about detecting maybe some hostility regarding Jewish people. But I also wonder if it might be worth, for anybody who's less familiar with some of the historical arguments, I put that maybe in air quotes, but this issue about Zelensky being an ultra-nationalist, and I know we haven't brought up the word denazification just yet, and I know that will come up in a future story, in our third story, a little bit more directly. But I wonder if this would be it would be worthwhile to maybe unpack that a little bit about, and how it relates to this kind of disinformation campaign, and the ways in which telling that story about the story that we think about Zelensky should undermine all of the lies about him actually reinforces the previous misinformation and disinformation campaigns.
Well, the story that we think should undermine, the narrative that he is a nationalist and a fascist, is that he has Jewish background, and therefore that seems very unlikely. But my personal opinion is that that is much less important, actually, than the fact that he's a Russian speaker. That's the one that should blow the Russian narrative out of the water, but somehow doesn't. There's some latent anti-Semitism in Russia and in the post-Soviet space, but it's not, I would say, the main racism that exists in that part of the world today. There's a lot more Islamophobia in Russia right now than there is anti-Semitism, and actually there's sort of a lot of positive racism towards Jews in Russia because, if people used to think they were sly, now they think they're smart, that sort of thing. And so, when people talk about Zelensky's Jewish background a lot, I think they're missing the larger point, which is that how can you claim that the leader of a country is so bent on eradicating the Russian language and Russian speakers that he would go to Nazi-like lengths to do it when he is himself a Russian speaker? Because it's easy to be Jewish and to be a fascist. I mean, we see plenty of people like that on the far right in Israel. But it's very difficult to be Jewish and a fascist in a country where you are, the minority. You can only really be a fascist in a country where you're part of the majority. And so, I hear the argument like, okay, he's Jewish, he can't be a fascist. But more importantly, he's a Russian speaker, so he can't be a Ukrainian nationalist. He's the Ukrainian president, who I believe is actually a very unifying figure for Ukraine, because he's popular across ethnic and linguistic lines. He doesn't represent ethnic Ukrainians necessarily. He doesn't represent ethnic Russians. He's like a third sort of party, a minority, and he's a Russian speaker that Ukrainian speakers have a lot of respect for. And that's why I think he was the man of the moment and the right person for the time when this challenge befell Ukraine.
It's for those of you who have seen any of his videos that have been posted, he often will speak. He'll speak in Ukrainian to Ukrainians, but also as a way of addressing Russians, of trying to get through to Russians that benefit of being able to actually speak Russian and to speak it as a native speaker of Russian. I think, again, I am a bit curious as if you think, what do you think it would take to break through such a, you brought up on the US, we have our own places where it just like, we're not talking about the same story. The same story hits differently to these different populations. We have our tribes, we have our kind of our teams that and we have a way of viewing the world. And I do think obviously we have to know how, if we're trying to convince someone, we kind of have to know how they view the world. But beyond that step, do you have any hope or sense of what might actually, is it things like Russian, speaking in Russian, or is it, who knows? We just we try and tell the truth and we hope something gets through. I don't know if you have optimism, pessimism here, or.
I do think it's important to speak to people in their own language in order to try to get them to listen to your message. And I think that a lot of countries in the former Soviet space, which quite understandably wanted to minimize the use of language, of the Russian language in their countries, because it had been suppressed for such a long time under the Soviet Union, and because their local native cultures had been eradicated by Russianization for so long. But I think, some of those efforts were actually counterproductive when it came to rallying local Russian speakers to the, in the case of the Baltic states, to the European cause, for example. And I think one of the only countries in that space that actually gets it is Estonia, which has quite a large Russian-speaking minority, about 30% of the population, but they also have a native Russian public television channel, Russian language public radio, Russian newspapers, and a lot of that is actually funded by the state. And the reason that they're doing that is because they realize if we're just going to pump out information in Estonian, which is a very difficult language, first of all. But second of all, people have an alternative. They have Russia right next door, and their antennas can pick up Russian television stations. So people are going to go for whatever's easiest. They're just going to listen to that. And they still do listen to that, even though the Estonian state provides public broadcasting in the Russian language. But they also listen to that. So they have a different view. And in Latvia, that's not the case. And in Latvia, there was actually quite a successful private Russian language channel, which was, I believe, shut down in a corruption investigation, which I think that situation could have been handled better. And I think interethnic relations in Latvia are a lot worse than they are in Estonia as a result. And I think Ukraine was kind of moving in that direction under Zelensky as well. The Poroshenko administration before him, it's much easier to call them ultra-nationalists because they were not nationalists. They weren't Nazis, but it was a easier stretch of the imagination from the point of view of the Russian propaganda. But once Zelensky came into power, there were already laws in place that regulated the amount of Russian language that could be broadcast on television. I think that Zelensky wanted to create, there were discussions about creating a Russian language TV station that would be ring fenced from those regulations so that there was an alternative for people who wanted to watch content from Ukraine in the Russian language to be able to do that. But for a long time, the argument in Ukraine has been, Russian culture and language is the behemoth. And there's no shortage of access to Russian language products if you want to get them. Why should we contribute to creating more? And so, there's no straightforward answer to that question.
No, it's those multilingual spaces, the what language are you communicating in becomes incredibly important, especially when language becomes one of the factors that people are using to justify forms of aggression and things along those lines. It's an interesting, and potentially a place where you would see outside international aid in terms of supporting Russian language media that is not Russian state media as an interesting, also complicated thing to do, which has a lot of.
I've got a lot to say about that as well, if we have the time. I don't know.
I was like, I have just opened one hell of a can of worms, which is a fascinating one. And so if you do have questions about that, I do want to, before we open that can of worms, and because I think we have this further questions about propaganda and how maybe Ukrainians are experiencing the result of Russian propaganda, as you kind of previewed a bit of this third story we want to talk about with these filtration camps and the ways in which people who have been kind of forced out of Ukraine, not just because of the battle, but actually forcibly taken from Ukraine into Russia. So the story actually was, I believe, literally just posted today on New York Times Video, yes? So it's called Surviving Russia's Filtration Camps. Do you want to talk, again, give a little bit of an introduction before we play a short clip?
Yeah, let me just give a tiny bit of background. We went to Estonia to speak with refugees from Ukraine who were forcibly displaced to Russia. And just as you just explained, Esther. But I just wanted to set up the idea that the reason that we were able to talk to these people is because they were the sort of small percentage of those who had been kicked out of Ukraine into Russia, but also had found a way to get out of Russia and into Estonia because we didn't have access to go and see them in the places that they had been resettled to in Russia. Because of what I talked about before. So it's a rather unscientific sample in the sense that, the sort of larger part of the people that have gone through this experience have not been able to get out of Russia yet and are still stuck there. So I think that's probably all say about that, because I don't remember exactly what was in the clip. And so I'll know what to fill in context-wise after we watch it.
So Matthew's going to go ahead and share this last clip. And I just want to remind everyone, these clips, we will put the links have been in the chat. If you didn't get them, we will put them back in the chat. But I also just want to, and we'll make sure to share them. There's great stuff. So I want to make sure, we will make sure everybody has access to all of these clips. I know there's been some Zoom issues with sound and mismatch of subtitles. So you will be able to watch them as they should be watched after the fact as well. So with that, Matthew, go ahead and start the clip.
Armed forces.
Заставили раздеться. И мы даже не чувствовали того, что мы стоим раздетые на морозе. Тогда достаточно холодно было. В состоянии шока, состояние вот такое страха, да.
Edward McJohn was badly injured when his apartment block was shelled. But Russian forces saw his injury as a sign he might be a fighter.
3 амбала, таких двухметровых чеченца, и так вот направляют на меня автомат. А я лежу, не могу ни пошевелиться, ничего. Я им говорю, ну не стреляйте, я раненый. А они подумали, что я, наверное, или украинский военный, ну что люди спрятали военного. И прибежали наши все соседи, женщины, ну начали кричать, мальчик раненый, ну как бы он не солдат.
Inside the filtration camps, people described interrogation, days of waiting, and harsh treatment.
Потом отвезли в Донецк, проходили эту фильтрацию. Это снятие отпечатков пальцев, фотографировали нас, спрашивали, какое, есть ли у нас знакомые среди военных Украины, батальонов.
Проверяли, там есть ребят сильно проверяли, раздевали полностью, там, может, до гола, я не знаю, смотрели татуировки, смотрели, чтобы не было ремешков от автоматов. Проверяли документы, паспорт, приписной и полностью телефон. И даже некоторых ребят и забрали. Уже они прошли вроде, потом все, тут с семьей даже ехал парень. Все, его там, какие причины, его раз и увели.
При вас?
Да, при нас. И он прощался, тоже сам телефон, и тут его все, и его забрали.
Those who make it past this part of the process get documents like this one, stating they've been fingerprinted. They're then brought to a train station in the Russian city of Taganrog, just across the Ukrainian border.
Никто нас не спрашивал, ни желания наши, ни что мы хотим, ни как мы хотим.
The people we spoke to described a system with no personal choice about their final destinations.
На вокзале нам сказали, нас везут в Тулу.
Сказали Ульяновск, и мы ехали 3 дня.
В итоге мы ехали на поезде 36 часов.
И мы в 2 часа ночи сели на поезд в Хабаровск. Мы ехали этих ужасных 9 дней. Каждый божий день просыпаешься, ты смотришь, ты в поезде едешь.
So I just remember as we were putting this story together last week, how the graphics editor was complaining that he was having problems with drawing a map because of the curvature of the earth getting in the way of the tool that allows him to draw the yellow arrow, all the way to the city of Khabarovsk in Russia's Far East. Because that's how far people were being sent who were being kicked out of Mariupol. Not all of them, obviously, but there were several cases that I was aware of just in the week that I spent in Estonia, where I'd heard of a family that was sent to Vladivostok. I'd actually heard of a man and his pregnant wife who were sent to a city called Nakhodka, which is even further away on the Pacific. And then, of course, our interviewee, Valeria, who we met right at the Russian border in Estonia, who had been sent to Khabarovsk and spent 9 days on the train. The scale of what is happening is really difficult to comprehend. 1.2 million Ukrainians, according to the United Nations, have ended up in Russia. And a lot of people ask, well, why do they go to Russia? Well, for one thing, it's very difficult when you're in Eastern Ukraine to flee west across the front line. It's very dangerous. For another thing, many of those people were forcibly kicked out of Mariupol, a city of 500,000 people. Literally, when you watch the piece later, if you have time, you'll hear some of the characters telling stories about how soldiers came into their basements, pointed guns at them, and told them that they had to leave. And then they were put on these buses, these transports to the filtration camps, which are essentially interrogation centers. And once they've been interrogated, and if they clear the interrogation, which many people do not, again, mostly men, then they're sent across the border to Russia. And when you get to the train station in Russia that everybody's sent to, and everybody's sent to the same train station, there will be a train at the platform, and they'll say, "This is your train, get on it and go. You can't stay here." And it's just the luck of the draw where you end up and where that train is heading to at that particular moment in time. And the entire time when you're talking to these people about these terrible things that have happened to them that really harken back to scenes from World War II, you ask yourself, how could people in Russia participate in this? Like, how can they not realize that they're the bad guys in this situation? And the answer to that goes back to what we were talking about before, which is that many people, especially people who work for the government in Russia, are convinced that Ukraine has been overrun by Nazis, and that they are saving these people from literal fascists who want to kill them because people in the Donbass primarily speak the Russian language. People believe this. And there was a story that I was telling Esther before the conference started that unfortunately had to get cut from the New York Times piece, where Lyudmila, one of our characters, tells us about a situation when she was on the train. And she was heading to Tula on the train, and they sent Russian medical officials and social workers and those sorts of people onto the train. And one of them sat down next to her and introduced herself as a psychologist and started telling everyone about how great life in Russia was going to be and how cheap the chicken was there. And she was just going on and on about how cheap the chicken was. And Lyudmila just lost it at that point because she had lost her home. She had left her father behind. She didn't know where her 30-year-old daughter was. She turned up later, but at that time she thought she might be dead or alive. And she had lost everything. And this woman is trying to convince her that she's going to have a great life in Russia and that she has nothing to worry about, and that she's going to be much safer now that the Russians have evacuated them from, the terrible Ukrainian fascists. And Lyudmila kind of had an outburst, and she said, "How dare you? How can you be talking about the price of chicken when I've lost so much?" And the woman sort of pulled out like a kind of, canned psychologist line and said, "Well, in life, certain things happen that you just can't change." But Lyudmila really had a comeback for her. She was like, "You can't change an earthquake. You can't change a flood. This was somebody's decision. You guys did this." And I'm kind of bummed that didn't make it into the piece. I thought it was powerful. But with this piece, usually when you want to have a strong narrative, a strong story that people remember, that sort of leaves a mark on the viewer, then instead of doing scattershot and telling a lot of people's stories, you focus on one person's stories and you get into the nitty-gritty details. And we couldn't really do that with this one because the purpose of this was to show the systematic nature of what was happening. And in order to be able to do that, we needed to be able to compare the experiences of many different people who had all largely gone through similar steps of the process in order for us to be able to convince the viewer of the scale of what was happening. So that's why we decided to go down the path that we went. It was kind of more of a sort of investigation of a phenomenon rather than trying to tell a larger story through the microcosm of one person's experience, which is usually the tactic that you use in broadcast journalism.
Well, it's again, I know Matthew's again sharing the links. We will send, you'll get an email tomorrow for everybody who attended here with the links. So you will have access to watch all of them. Obviously, you know, even without the great story about the price of chicken, which I also, there's some great stories that we couldn't share everything. We are, I want to talk a little bit more, maybe specifically about this story. I think that, but and maybe gearing up towards the end. But I also want to just point out, we do have, still plenty of time for questions. If you would like to actually ask your question to Simon yourself, if you could, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the raise your hand feature. If you raise your hand, I can call on you. I can allow you to speak, and so you can actually address your question directly. I think we have enough time to do some questions that way if people are interested. So I did want to kind of focus in on this question of I think it's really this idea of trying to get at the systematic nature as opposed to just following one person. As much as an individual story can be really interesting and powerful, to get at the systematic nature. And I wonder if maybe you could try and connect, start maybe trying to connect these three stories a little bit. So we've got, in general, if I take the middle story, which is just the ways in which the Russian state media in particular has basically created a news environment or a news bubble that really prevents any factual engagement with what's going on, that allows this idea of, Russia as the bad guy, or Russia as, even if we take away the word bad, Russia as the instigator, right? You could see in that piece, that discussion of Russia didn't start it, Ukraine started it, NATO started it, the US started it. This was started by other people, not by Russia. And then you have the story of, the violence, the executions, the murdering of civilians. And then you have, again, on the level of atrocities, this forced migration or forced removal from people's homes, not just their homes, but their homelands, and an attempt to turn them from Ukrainian into Russian, encouraging them to apply for Russian citizenship. I think it wasn't quite I don't think it was in that clip, but that notion of, if you do that, then you're going to be, wherever they dropped you off, you're going to be stuck for 3 years, and you're going to have to turn over your passport, your Ukrainian passport. So the ability to leave once you start that process would be even more challenging than just the logistical process. So the ways in which, how are we viewing it, the way in which Russia is viewing this conflict, and maybe even thinking about the way Ukraine is engaging. Ukrainians themselves are experiencing this far more viscerally and directly, obviously. Which is not much of a question, so I apologize, but just the ways in which information just seems, the difficulty of finding good information, what to do when people won't listen or have been primed to reject good information, and then what, I'm still kind of flabbergasted by people having, if that's the right word, of Ukrainians then just having to deal with people who are like trying to explain to them that life will be better once the price of chicken is lower.
Unfortunately, I don't have a sort of applied answer to how to fix disinformation. I wish I did, because we could probably use an answer like that for a lot of what is going on in our own country. And I think a lot of people who are much smarter than I am have been thinking about this issue and kind of banging their heads against the wall and getting nowhere with it. And I kind of wish that there were a silver bullet that you could use, especially in the case of Ukraine, which is in Russia, which is a country that countries that I obviously care very much about, where I'm from, where my family is from, where a lot of my friends and colleagues come from. And I would like nothing more than the violence to stop. And if we could find a way of toning down the rhetoric in the Russian media that sort of incites people against Ukrainians to believe that they are doing so for a just cause, then we could solve a lot of problems there. I think the reality of the situation that we have to face as, you know, an international community is that Russia isn't going to be stopped by megaphones on the border or, you know, Radio Free Europe sending links via Twitter or Instagram or something. That if only the Russians had, you know, the right information, then they would stop their government from doing what it's doing. I think that the only force is going to actually stop Russia from doing what it's doing. And the Russians are willing to use a lot more force than anybody else, you know, in the equation. And so, you know, how do you stop a steamroller? I guess you got to stop it with another steamroller. And I think maybe people haven't come to that realization yet in a visceral way, on an emotional level, and don't realize that this is going to go on as long as we as an international community allow it to go on. And, you know, we've sort of really gotten off the topic of disinformation here, but that's the unfortunate reality, in my view.
Well, so we do have Isaac has his hand up. Isaac, I've clicked to allow you to talk. If you can unmute and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for setting this up, and thank you, Simon, for such a great presentation. It's interesting. Just a quick question. I was curious what your thoughts were on the sort of, I guess you say, explosion of open source intelligence, you know, OSINT sort of sphere stuff that seems to have really become popular on social media and generally everywhere. Sort of, do you think that this has been a positive or negative trend? And what is the line between these sorts of, I guess, OSINT sources and, you know, your sort of typical freelancers?
I mean, I think OSINT is great because it helps us establish what has happened after the fact, and people can do it from a great distance. And we have technology at our fingertips that allows us to see pictures from space, you know, and we also have, you know, Google Maps that allows us to compare those pictures to real locations. And there's some people out there doing like amazing things by comparing, you know, where the shadow fell when a particular video was filmed to, you know, identify the time of day that a particular event happened. And all of that is really amazing. And yeah, I would be crazy to say that that's a negative eventuality, because, you know, one of the biggest investigations that I've ever done personally as a journalist was an OSINT investigation called Selfie Soldiers in 2015 about the first chapter of the Ukrainian war, where I used a Russian soldier's social media posts to place him in Ukraine. And I basically identified, with the help of some people at Bellingcat, the locations where photographs were taken. And then I went to those places myself and photographed myself in the same poses as the soldiers were, you know, in front of the same background of trees or buildings or what have you, where they stood, in order, again, to show the viewer that I'm not just saying this soldier was in Russia, or sorry, this Russian soldier was in Ukraine. I've actually gone and verified the place myself. So I sort of took the OSINT concept, the remote reporting concept, and then as my starting point, and then confirmed it with sort of more traditional reporting on the ground methods, which is my nature. Because, you know, I don't really know what the point of being a reporter is if you're not actually getting to travel and see things with your own eyes. But I'm glad there's people out there who are willing to do it and sit in front of their computers and never go anywhere. But that's just not my idea of interesting investigation. But really happy that people are out there and doing it. And I think that other people should, you know, then use their investigation as a stepping stone to take it further and to go and confirm it with traditional reporting methods like speaking to people over the phone, face to face, what have you. But sort of building it out, because a lot of times it's difficult to trust somebody online who puts a caption underneath a photograph and says, well, this is a Russian soldier in Ukraine. That might not be so convincing. So I don't think it's like the answer to journalism.
If I could ask maybe just a slight follow-up on that, I'm curious if you think there's a difference. Do you either in your own reporting or in maybe the approach of, say, the media in general, has there been a difference in, say, how Ukraine was covered in 2014, 2015, around that initial start, this kind of start of this war, basically, and the annexation of Crimea and things, and then post-February 20, the buildup, but certainly post-February 24th, with bombs dropping in Ukraine, and kind of the kind of beginning of this hot phase of this war, I guess?
Well, I would say that there's a lot less ambiguity this time around in terms of what has actually happened. Because for years after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and then the start of the war in eastern Ukraine, there were arguments about who the main actors in the war actually were. That's why I had to do that investigation, Selfie Soldiers, to prove that Russia had actually used its regular service people in the conflict, because at that time Russia was claiming that it was a civil war in Ukraine and that all of the fighters engaged in it were local Russian speakers fighting against Ukrainian nationalists, and that Russia had nothing to do with it, so leave us out of it. Mm-hmm. And that made it much difficult, much more, it was a smart strategy. It made it much more difficult to rally international support for sanctions against Russia to try to prevent what it was doing. And for those, in Europe and even in the United States, who wanted, for business reasons, to continue having open relations with Russia, there was the ambiguity, there was the space for them to push for that, because it wasn't black and white. And although it was black and white, but it didn't seem black and white. And so, I think the Russian government, Putin, really overplayed their hand this time around. And by sort of going full Monty, they've shown the world their true face, and then created this united opposition in terms of sanctions and weapons supplies to Ukraine. Because don't forget that during the Obama administration, our government was shy to supply the Ukrainians with weapons to allow them to defend their country. We provided them with so-called lethal weapons, which were anti-artillery radars, flak vests, vehicles, but not with guns on them, and things like that. And it was only after the Trump administration, when Trump had been embroiled in quite a few scandals that made him look like a Russian stooge, that he decided that he would, show that he wasn't a Russian stooge by supplying the Ukrainians with the Javelin anti-tank missiles that have become so famous now. And now we're in the Biden administration, and obviously that's been scaled up to much higher powered weapons like 155 millimeter self-propelled artillery pieces and various kinds of drones, and you name it, from all over the world, and not just the United States. And it would have been impossible to imagine several years ago that the Germans would ever supply weapons of war to another country. And even though they're lagging behind everybody else, the fact that they're doing it just speaks to the incredible shift in perception of Russia's role in this conflict as compared to when it first broke out in 2014.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I want to take another question from the Q&A box here from John O'Leary. He writes, my understanding is that Russia has purposely been using refugees to destabilize Western countries. Do you anticipate Ukrainian refugees in Russia eventually being used in the same way, or does it seem they want to keep them in Russia?
I think Belarus has probably used refugees to try to play politics with Europe more than Russia has. In 2020, after the failed uprising that tried to overthrow Lukashenko, not only did Belarus produce a lot of its own refugees, but they started channeling people by plane from the Middle East and allowing them right up to the Polish border and the Lithuanian border in order to put pressure on European authorities who had enacted sanctions against Belarus over the treatment of people who participated in the uprising. And it was his way of trying to bring the Europeans back to the negotiating table. You know, I think Russia is probably colluded with Assad to do something similar, to push refugees out of Syria into Turkey and then onto Europe again, for various political reasons, but mostly to draw the Europeans into negotiations of whatever is important to Russians at that moment. And in this war, I think that the refugees are not a political tool; they are a consequence of, you know, the fighting. And the primary goal of the war is to conquer territory, conquer Ukraine, and Russify Ukraine and sort of pull it, if not in whole, then in part, out of the Western orbit. I think they would have tried to, you know, their original plans were much grander than their eventual strategy of just trying to take the east of Ukraine. But, you know, I think we should see it through the context of that. And in terms of the refugees who end up having to go to Russia itself, they are also being pushed out by fighting and by the fighters from Russia, and just from the dangerous situation. And I think partially to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe on the scale of which, you know, it wouldn't be possible to ignore, the Russians have instituted this very draconian system of how they get people into Russia and where they take them to, where nobody has any choice in what happens to them, and they go through these filtration camps where men are disappeared. You know, I think in this situation, the Russians are dealing with the consequences of the war that they started in a very ham-fisted way. And that's what's happening. But it's echoing what has happened in previous eras when people were put on trains by Russia during World War II, entire ethnic populations, and dispatched to, you know, Central Asia and Siberia and the Far East. And, you know, I got a lot of deja vu when I was investigating the units that had participated in the Bucha massacre, because there was actually a unit that was stationed in Khabarovsk that had been sent there, and the Ukrainian military intelligence had published a list of the names of the people in that unit who had come to Ukraine. And as I was going through it, there were just so many obviously super Ukrainian surnames among the Russian soldiers who had been sent to try to take Kiev. And that's because in World War II, so many Ukrainians from Western Ukraine had been deported as suspected sympathizers to Siberia, that for a couple of generations after the end of the war, there were purely Ukrainian-speaking villages in the Far East. And these people were the descendants of those people, but they had long forgotten that history and now had come back to Ukraine to try to conquer it for Russia. And it's just, and the same thing happening with the Chechens now in a much more recent history. And it's just so sad to think about how quickly your history can be erased. It only takes one generation.
Well, I know we're kind of running. Oh, I think we've got some more questions. I accidentally, let me go through that. Thank you for that. While I'm going to try and read some of these other questions, we've got a few minutes left, so I'll read the two that I see here. But if I could ask also, Matthew, if you could go ahead and post the link to the survey we have. This is something that we use. We want to create the best kind of educator content and events that we can for people. And so this is really helpful for both our center and our fellow UChicago centers, as well as Pulitzer Center, to take that information. So I know that link will be in the chat, and I'll include it in a follow-up email as well. So two last questions. I'll read them, and Simon, you can decide how, if you want to answer both of them or how you want to put them together. So the first is from John Simon. He says, some very good points on countering Russian propaganda. Thank you for your work. How do you respond to Western critics with more sophisticated arguments who emphasize pre-February 2022 death tolls and the conflict beginning in 2008 or 2014 and being provoked by the West, UChicago's own John Mearsheimer, Henry Kissinger, John Helmer, Jacques Baud, blaming kind of NATO, this issue of NATO expansion and that side of things. And then Isaac also has another question. He says, at several points during the war, Ukrainian forces have been able to make bombing runs on Russian territory. Did these attacks make any unique impact in the Russian-speaking media sphere? So one question is, how do you respond to West and
With the second question, I'll say right away that I don't know that there was any kind of specific particular reaction to those events that would have been out of the ordinary or different to some of the attacks that happened in Ukraine proper, because I think if we're talking about Russian state media, then they tend to only focus on issues like civilian casualties that they believe are caused by the Ukrainian forces, and their own sort of purported victories. Those are kind of the two main focuses of Russian state media as it concerns the war. And I think the attacks inside Russia are actually embarrassing for Russia and not something that they want to focus attention on. In terms of the first question, I have been a reporter for a long time, and Ukraine is not my first war. And in fact, I covered the war in Iraq in 2006 for, well, the war went on for much longer, but my period of covering it was in 2006 for Agence France Presse. And at that time, nobody made excuses for the United States and its attack on Iraq. We, as reporters, reported on what was happening there, on the civilian death toll, on the mercenaries, on the American military's atrocities, as fully and as deeply as we could. And while the government for a long time tried to push this idea that it was all necessary because of weapons of mass destruction, those were never found. And the United States did not win that moral argument. That was roundly condemned internationally and by many people in the United States itself. And I think that we should hold Russia today to the same standards that we hold ourselves to. And we shouldn't make excuses for them as though they had been bullied into a corner, because I see their argument of NATO expansion as being the same kind of red herring as weapons of mass destruction. Both things promise to be so dangerous that the only thing you can do is preemptively strike. And that argument doesn't stand up in a court of law, and that argument doesn't stand up to me ethically, just as an observer. And so I don't think that we should really play into that kind of a logic where somebody gets to say, well, I think they were going to punch me, so that's why I punched them. You know, that's not, you know, Russia punched first. Russia started the war. It's Russia's fault. That's just how it is. We're all grown-ups here.
On that note, I want to thank everyone who attended and made it through the whole conversation. We really appreciate it. Again, you will get links via email for all of Simon's reporting videos, and this video will be available in the coming days on our UChicago Educator outreach page, and probably also our series evaluation page. I will ask you again if you can please fill out our evaluation form. And again, I encourage you to come back tomorrow at the same time and on Thursday. And then if you can, join us in person on Tuesday on June 28th. So we'll continue talking about these types of questions about disinformation and conflict throughout other parts of the world. And again, I want to really thank Simon for taking so much time with us tonight and sharing your reporting and your thoughts with us. We really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much for the invitation. Thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to share some of my experiences about my reporting, and I can't wait till we do this again next time.
Sounds good. Thank you for everyone. Again, thank you again, and I hope everyone has a good night.